In this episode, we're going to unravel a bizarre sequence of devastating events that took place some 200 years ago. Murders involving red shoes, a piece of cake, a caged corpse strung up high on the hillside, and a man banished to the other side of the world. Incredibly, the events all took place within sight of the same peculiar Peak District landmark, Peter's Stone. I'm Holly Nebel. In this series, I'm teaming up with my brother Tim, a local archivist, to investigate some of the more mysterious episodes of Peak District history. Together, we'll be delving deep into the archives and roaming high on heath-clad hills as we explore the past of the peaks and offer you a peek in the past.
Art thou suspended here on high? What a sight to meet a father's eye, to see what most I prized, what most I loved, what most I cherished, and once most approved, hung in mid-air to feast the nauseous worm, and waving horrid in the midnight storm.
This setting seems so idyllic on the surface. The banks fizz with grasshoppers, dance with butterflies and sparkle with buttercups. First impressions today are of a blissful spot teeming with wildlife, yet its past is associated with shocking death. Peter's Stone can be found near the hamlet of Wardlow Myers. Now there's something startling about this site, otherworldly, out of place and out of time. It's a place shadowed with secrets where many people fear to tread. Thankfully, one of them is not historian Ian Morgan, who has written a book about some very ghastly goings-on around here some 2 centuries ago. What can you tell us about what life might have been like 200 years ago?
Well, 200 years ago, life would have been very different to today. If, unfortunately, the weather was bad, you had to live on your reserves. If winter was bad and you were cut off, there was every likelihood, if it came to the worst, you'd starve.
The person at the centre of our story is someone called Anthony Lingard. What do you know about his early life?
His really early life, very little. What we do know, however, as he grew up, the family that he was in grew in size. His parents probably struggled, so times were hard. Frequently, he would probably go short. And that would give him an idea that he had to survive and survive on his wits.
Whilst Holly's learning about Lingard's life out in the wilderness of Wardlow Myers, I've been following up some of Ian's historical research by delving into the archives, which has brought me here, the beautiful church of St John the Baptist, known as the Cathedral of the Peak, in the neighbouring village of Tideswell. This was the historic parish church which served local communities such as those in Lytton and Wardlow Myers centuries ago.
Anthony Lingard and his siblings were all baptised at this church. This is a page from the baptism registers in 1791. As the vicar, the Reverend Shuttleworth, baptised these babies, he could never have imagined that one of them would grow up to commit a despicable crime which would cast a long dark shadow over the community and which would ultimately help to change the laws of a nation. Anthony Lingard was introduced to death from a very young age. The Tideswell burial registers record the deaths of many pauper children who worked and died at the notorious local cotton factory, Lytton Mill. But for the community in Lytton outside the mill at this point in time, infant death was also commonplace. The Tideswell burial registers record how, within the space of just 18 days in spring 1797, 3 of Anthony Lingard's brothers all died. As 5-year-old Anthony watched helplessly as his brothers died around him, little did he know how he too would also suffer a premature death. However, unlike his siblings, he would never be granted the dignity of a burial here in the parish churchyard.
What do we know about the events of January 1815?
Well, following a harsh winter and a poor autumn, fogs had settled all around this area. And we know that by January the 15th, 1815, he was worried. The problem he had, a local girl was pregnant and it was his child. And so he decided to try and get her to blame someone else for the pregnancy. And his only way out of the situation was money. But where to get it? He's poor. Everywhere there's a lack of money.
It was during the early hours of the 15th of January 1815 that Anthony Lingard stole down from his house in Lytton to Wardlow Myers, specifically to the toll house there, which was kept by the middle-aged widow Hannah Oliver. A struggle broke out and he slipped a scarf around Hannah's neck and strangled her. The only thing he took from the toll house was some money and a pair of red women's shoes.
And the red shoes, that seems like a very strange thing to take. So why did he do this?
He makes his way to the house of the young lady that's pregnant, gives her money and a pair of shoes. If he can bribe her, then he is free to do whatever he wants. Bright shoes, red shoes, probably in those days every girl's desire.
Hannah Oliver's body was discovered the next day and a murder investigation was launched.
It was the red shoes that would eventually be Anthony Lingard's final undoing. When the girl took the shoes back to Anthony Lingard, not really believing where they came from, doubt set in her mind. She told the constables, they searched his house and they found them.
Lingard was arrested and sent to Derby Jail to await trial for murder.
Lingard's trial on the 25th of March 1815 was a sensation, capturing the interest of the public and reported in newspapers all over the country. The reports revealed that the crucial witness who testified against him was the young woman pregnant with his child.
It appeared in evidence the prisoner committed the robbery and murder in the night of Sunday the 15th of January last. He took from the house several pounds in cash and notes and a pair of new woman's shoes. Immediately after the deed was perpetrated, he went to a young woman in the neighbourhood who was pregnant by him and offered to give her some money with a view to induce her to father the child upon some other person. That he gave her the shoes and also some money. The shoes, however, were returned to him, and the evidence adduced in respect to them as to leave no doubt in the minds of everyone that the prisoner was the person who had committed the murder.
The reports conclude with a description of how the judge, Sir John Bailey, donned his black cap and delivered the sentence.
I sentence you to death by hanging.
I followed in Lingard's footsteps to Derby Jail, now a working museum, to meet the current jail owner, historian Richard Felix.
This is a cell very similar to what Anthony Lingard would have spent his last few days in, contemplating what was going to happen to him.
Would Lingard have been only too aware of his fate then?
As he got closer to the execution, he would actually have heard through this window, and remember there would have been no glass in it then, he would have actually heard them constructing the gallows. All executions in Great Britain were public until 1868, and all of the villagers from all around, from Castleton, from Lytton, everywhere around there would all have travelled to Derby. On the day of his execution, his family, his friends, anybody that knew anybody would travel here because it was a public day out.
This report details Lingard's execution, and it includes a very peculiar detail at the end.
At 12 o'clock, he was brought upon the drop in front of the county jail and, after a short time occupied in prayer with the chaplain, he was launched into eternity. Before the judge left town, he directed that the body of Lingard should be hung in chains in the most convenient place near the spot where the murder was committed, instead of being dissected and anatomised. The usual practice at the time for an executed criminal would have been for the body to be dissected for medical science purposes. However, in this particular case, the judge took the more unusual step of ordering Lingard's body to be gibbeted.
he would actually have been measured in this cell by the blacksmith, and that was known as his last suit. Your body would then be tarred. This is after death. To preserve it longer, it would then be transported, and remember, all the way from here back to Wardlow Myers. I mean, it's a good 40 odd miles. It cost a lot of money, and it would then, with great ceremony, with people coming to see, would be hoisted up 30 feet in the air and left there swinging in the breeze. The thing was that you were hanged 30 feet high on a gibbet post, and it was always near the scene of the murder. It was to be a deterrent.
I wonder if there's anything left of Lingard that we could have a look at.
Just a bit. Oh boy, yeah. I mean, I've actually got something to show you. I mean, this is original door from Derby Jail. It was painted and we had it dipped. And when we had it dipped, this graffiti came out of the door. Two guys up there hanged in 1804. That's great. But that is the interesting one, because that up there is a gibbet post. And that's what Anthony Lingard would be hung up 30 feet in the air on a gibbet post. Now, the only person we have at this period that was gibbeted here was Anthony Lingard. And if you look at the side of it here, there's initials. That's most definitely an A. And what that is, I don't know. But it could well be an L. Is that his message to us before he was executed? I don't know. I can't prove it. I think Anthony Lingard put that on there.
We're now heading back to Wardlow Myers via the route that Lingard's body would have taken. His body was escorted by armed soldiers and passed right through the Chatsworth estate here, the majestic home of the Duke of Devonshire. What must the Duke have thought? Many a grand carriage would have passed through this elegant estate, but rarely the embalmed corpse of an executed murderer. Lingard's body arrived back in Wardlow Myers on the night of the 31st of March 1815 and was placed in a barn overnight, reputed to be the one which still stands next door to the rather creepy-looking Three Stags Heads Inn. After lying in the barn overnight, the following morning Lingard's corpse was strung up on a gibbet post across the road. Lingard's gibbet attracted much interest. Word of the grisly sight travelled fast. A huge crowd assembled and traders flocked here to cash in on the sightseeing. This desolate spot was transformed into a bustling, macabre marketplace. You wonder how Lingard's family must have reacted to this dreadful sight of the body of their loved one hanging over them, literally, for all to see, dominating the skyline and the talk of the whole community.
Now we have a rather unusual source which articulates the anguish Lingard's parents must have felt about the gibbeting of their son.
William Newton, a local mill owner and poet who became known as the Minstrel of the Peak, was one of the locals who gazed in horror on the gibbet. He penned a poignant poem about Lingard's father being confronted with the terrible sight of his son's corpse.
Newton's poem highlighted the revulsion rather than the macabre fascination of the act of gibbeting. It was widely published at the time and is credited with helping to fuel the campaign to abolish its practice. This is William Newton's grave in Tideswell Churchyard.
You couldn't get anything more opposed to Lingard's end, not entombed in the earth, but hoisted high into the air to rot in a cage, exposed to the wild weather and wide-eyed stares of thousands of sightseers.
We now know about Lingard's dreadful fate, but something I'm wondering is what happened to his pregnant lover and the unborn child he left behind. His lover was never mentioned on any of the trial reports, so it remains a bit of a mystery. We're on the outskirts of Lytton here, which would have been Lingard's home village. Can we find anything more about his pregnant lover?
Well, the Tideswell Church registers might provide some clues as to her identity. So I've got here a page of baptisms in Tideswell in 1815, and we have down here on May the 30th a Mary Hannah, illegitimate daughter of Grace Wager, a single woman of Lytton.
So this Grace Wager, she could very well have been the person who testified against Lingard?
Yes, quite possibly.
And this name as well, Mary Hannah, I do wonder whether the baby might have been named after the murdered toll housekeeper Hannah Oliver.
Yeah, that would be a nice way to bring the sorry tale of Lingard to a close. So just a few months after Hannah Oliver was murdered, a new baby entering the world carrying forward her name. But unfortunately there are still a couple of shocking twists to come. And the first twist can actually be revealed in the same Tideswell registers. So just 3 years later in 1818, Jane, daughter of Jane Grant of Lytton, who was buried in September 1818, aged 21. And if you have a little look down here, there's an intriguing detail about just how she died, which is very unusual to find in a burial register.
Poisoned wilfully by arsenic by Hannah Bocking. Ah, okay, so here we have another murder. I'm hoping Ian Morgan will be able to shed further light on this mysterious second murder.
Well, Hannah Bocking, she's 16 years old. Her friend, who she's actually walking with, is Jane Grant, who's 21 years old. They've both been given the task of walking down this path to let the cows out of the field. But on this particular day, Hannah gives Jane a present. It's a fine cake. Unbeknown to Jane though, that would be her nemesis, because the cake was laced with arsenic.
So they were friends then, and obviously lacing a cake with arsenic is quite a cunning way to kill someone. What was the motive here?
It's jealousy, pure jealousy. 16-year-old Hannah, well, she'd just lost her job, actually working for her own stepfather, the Brammer family. Her temperament was so bad, she was dismissed. Who takes over the same position that she's just left? Jane Grant. It was just pure jealousy, nothing else.
Would Jane Grant have just dropped dead after eating the cake then? Would it have happened in this field?
Not in this case, because the amount of arsenic was just the right amount. Too much arsenic, you don't actually ingest it before you vomit it out. Too little has no effect. In this case, Jane took the cake home and was so ill, when they tried to treat her, she actually implicated Hannah herself. It was Jane's claim, we'll say, that Hannah had poisoned the cake that led to Hannah being arrested. Taken to Derby jail, she awaited trial, and they say she didn't shed a tear at all for being there, even though she's only 16.
Whilst Holly's in Wardlow Myers, I've remained here in Lytton looking for local newspaper reports about Hannah's trial back in March 1819. This report from the Derby Mercury reveals how Hannah purchased the arsenic some 10 weeks before she mixed it with the fatal cake. It's clear this was no sudden, spur-of-the-moment fit of jealous rage, but a carefully planned, premeditated act of cold-blooded murder.
Thanks for having us back here.
Pleasure.
Now, I'm on the trail of a second murderer from Lytton, Hannah Bocking, who ended up here just 3 years after Lingard. And I'm hoping to find out more about what happened to Hannah after she was imprisoned here.
This is a broadsheet done at the time. What happened was that the local newspaper used to come and make an appointment with you in the condemned cell and write down your whole life, and then it was sold at your public execution for a penny a sheet.
So Hannah Bocking, aged 16 of Lytton near Bakewell, Derbyshire, who suffered on Monday the 22nd of March 1819 on the New Drop in front of the county jail, Derby, for wilfully poisoning Jane Grant. So Hannah Bocking, like Lingard, was actually hung in this very jail.
Hannah Bocking is actually the youngest person ever hanged here at Derby. Hannah was brought here, sentenced to death, but not only to death, but to after death, because she was a murderer. And after 1752, the Murder Act came into being, which stated that no murderer was allowed to be buried.
I've got here another newspaper report, this time describing Hannah's execution. It relates how it had been over 60 years since a female had been executed in Derby. This, combined by the fact that she's a mere child of 16, was enough to excite a powerful interest in the minds of spectators.
When the time arrived that the light of heaven was to be withdrawn from her eyes, she ascended the platform with a steady step. She joined indeed in the devotions of the chaplain, but she seemed little affected by the apparatus which held the spectators in a state of appalling suspense. At the moment she was launched into eternity, an involuntary shuddering pervaded the assembled crowd, and though she had excited little sympathy, a general feeling of horror was expressed that one so young should have been so guilty and so insensible.
After Hannah's execution, the report details how her friends asked for her body to be returned to them for burial, but the full sentence of the law prevailed, only for her not to be carved up by the wild wind of the peaks on a gibbet, but by the surgeon's knife, as her body was handed over for medical dissection purposes.
Part of the sentence was that you'd be hanged by the neck until you are dead, and then publicly dissected in the Shire Hall in St Mary's Gate in Derby. And the whole idea was the body wasn't whole, and that meant that on the day of judgment, no physical resurrection for you, where you're going to go. That's what they knew about in that condemned cell beforehand. They knew that not only they were going to die, that wasn't their fear, it was where they went next, and that was sentencing them to hell. It was part of the sentence for a murderer, and that's what happened to poor old Hannah Bocking. So can you just imagine her thoughts sat in that dark condemned cell the night before she knew that she was going to be taken out from that cell onto the front of Derby Jail, publicly strangled to death, and then her body dissected.
I've tracked down Hannah Bocking's record in the Derby Assize Court Register for March 1819. It records her conviction here for murder, and her sentence is death, with a later amendment confirming how she's been executed. So stark words which don't really fully convey the extraordinary events which led to her life coming to an awful end, aged just 16. Now, if we fast forward through these same court registers to 1826, we come across another terse death sentence which belies another astonishing story involving a name which sounds eerily familiar. We have here a William Lingard sentenced to death for highway robbery. Incredibly, there was yet another crime committed beneath the gaze of Lingard's gibbet, but this time involving someone much more closely associated with Lingard himself, his younger brother, William.
William Lingard worked as a weaver, and in 1825 his wife Anne had recently given birth to a daughter, so he had the pressure of an extra mouth to feed. On 30th of July 1825, along with an accomplice, William Bennett, he robbed a local butcher who was returning from a market held in Lytton. This crime was also carried out by the very spot where the rotting remains of William's brother hung in chains. William's death sentence was later commuted to transportation for life to Australia. We're able to access fascinating convict records from Australia which show how William became an incorrigible offender on the other side of the world. His convict record is a catalogue of misdemeanours. Out in Australia he was found guilty of affray, theft, insolence, disorderly conduct. In 1839 he actually managed to escape from a chain gang and became a bushranger before being tracked down and captured after a dramatic armed shootout in the outback. He was then sent to endure the living hell of Norfolk Island, a penal colony 1,000 miles from the Sydney coastline, notorious for its extremely harsh conditions for only the very worst offenders. A final point of interest is how these records also include physical descriptions of each convict. So we have here William Lingard, 5'6 3/4", brown hair, blue eyes, oval face, scar on his left arm, allowing us to put flesh at last on the Lingard bones.
Unlike Anthony Lingard and Hannah Bocking, I've managed to escape from Derby Jail alive. Now, Lingard's corpse was strung up on the gibbet for 11 years, following long-standing complaints from local landowners about the disturbances caused by the sightseers and the noise of Lingard's bones rattling inside the metal cage. In 1826, 1 month after Anthony's brother William was banished to Australia, the gibbet was finally dismantled. Lingard's bones were buried beneath the gibbet post, but as we've discovered, not all of them, it seems. We recoil at the thought of the crowds flocking from far and wide to gawp at the grisly spectacle of Lingard's gibbet back in the 1800s. Yet incredibly, 200 years later, it appears that Lingard's skull is still on public display, still an object of morbid fascination. Thinking about Lingard's skull, I'm reminded how easy it is to focus on the macabre and sensational aspects of the Lingard and Bocking crimes and overlook the abject human misery and suffering which lie beneath the surface. Cycles of poverty exacerbated by the loss of loved ones, families deprived of breadwinners. Now, Tim's uncovered some records which highlight the harsh reality of the human costs of the events we've examined. In particular, the heavy toll the Lingard family would pay many years after that fateful night when Lingard crept into the toll house at Wardlow Myers to commit that terrible crime.
This is New Home Hospital in the Peak District market town of Bakewell. It was once the dreaded union workhouse for the locality. Only those in desperate poverty would have applied to enter its walls. Now, I have here copies of extracts from a minute book dated 1840 kept by the Guardians who ran this workhouse. Now, one name in particular leaps out of their records: Lingard of Lytton. This time, Betty Lingard, Anthony and William's younger sister. The records indicate how Betty had abandoned her two illegitimate children, Eliza and Alice, who were found almost naked on the street and were rehoused at the workhouse. So this is some 25 years after the murder of the toll house keeper, and the Lingard family is still clearly suffering.
You can't help but wonder if the misfortune to befall Betty Lingard and her poor children might have been avoided had it not been for the crimes of her older brothers wreaking such misery on the family. I feel Anthony Lingard's presence will forever linger here. The gibbet's shadow loomed large over his family and the local community years after his death. And some say, even today, the ghostly sound of bones chattering in an iron cage can sometimes be heard on the wind, which wails through this wild ravine.
If crime demand it, let the offender die. But let no more the gibbet brave the sky. No more let vengeance on the dead be hurled, but hide the victim from a gazing world.